Okay. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Christine Ingram. I'm the local interest librarian here at the New Hanover County Public Library. I will be recording this session to go on our website and moderating questions towards the end of our session. We are here today as part of Read Across the County, a community-wide reading program sponsored by the New Hanover County Public Library, the New Hanover County's Office of Diversity and Equity, and the Friends of New Hanover County Public Library. Our selected titles this year aim to inspire us to understand one another, appreciate our diversity, and unite our community through art and expression. Our adult title this year is Hell of a Book by Jason Mott of Bolton, North Carolina. Jason Mott has a BFA in fiction and an MFA in poetry, both from UNC Wilmington. Hell of a Book is the National Book Award winner for 2021, and Mott has won the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction and been a nominee for the Pushcart Prize, the NAACP Image Award, and the Carnegie Medal for Excellence long list. From Mott's website, Hell of a Book is a story that goes to the heart of racism, police violence, and the hidden cost extracted upon Black Americans and America as a whole. In Hell of a Book, an African-American author sets out on a cross-country book tour to promote his best-selling novel. The storyline drives Jason Mott's novel and is a scaffolding of something much larger and more urgent. Since his novel also tells the story of Soot, a young Black boy living in a rural town in the recent past, and The Kid, a possibly imaginary child who appears to the author on tour. Today's event is the second in a series of topical discussions based around the themes found in the book. The topic tonight is family history and intergenerational trauma. Our final panel discussion will be this coming Tuesday, August 16th from 5:30 to 7. Registration is open on our website, and it will be about policing diverse communities. Read Across the County will culminate in a final event, an author visit by Jason Mott, next Saturday, August 20th from 2:30 to 4 p.m. at the Northeast Branch. Seating is limited and registration is open online. Today, we are joined by Cedric Harrison, Director of Port City United, Dr. Bob McKenzie from Veterans Affairs, Jvanete Skiba, Assistant Director of Equity, Education, and Engagement with the New Hanover County Resiliency Task Force. We will hear from our panel with a chance for questions and comments towards the end. Anybody attending online, please feel free to put questions and comments in the chat and Q&A box, and I will pass those along as necessary. I'm going to just moderate between online and in person. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us. And I'm going to pass this over to our panel. If you'll hold me on just a second, I'm going to switch technologies around. All right. And with that, our panel. Do you all want to start by introducing yourselves a little bit and kind of just going through your history and how you got to where you are now?
I'm Bob McKenzie. I'm a psychiatrist. I've been in Wilmington for the last 2 years, moving here with my wife and 3 kids after being in the Army for 36 years. So spent my whole life moving around and working with active duty service members and all of that. And we were finishing up, look for a wonderful community to have our forever home, be by the beach, do all that. So Wilmington, it meets all of those criteria. We love it very much. And like Christine said, I work at the VA, so it's always become a natural progression for me to go from active duty to dealing with veterans and helping them. So a very easy transition. I got asked to be involved in this panel because my wife, Mari, works for the Office of Diversity and Equity, and her boss, Linda Thompson, thought that offered me an opportunity to be a part of this and such an interesting topic, and seems like such a good, a reasonable thing to be discussing, an important topic to discuss. So I thought, of course, I want to be part of that. So that's how I got involved in it. Very much happy to be here tonight. Absolutely loved the read.
I loved the read. Jvanete Skiba, task force. A lot of the work that I do is educating our community on trauma and resilience. So being able to be a part of this discussion is right up my alley. And not to mention having a book like Hell of conversation is giving people an account to kind of go back to as we kind of talk about some things that can be challenging, but it's still an enjoyable read. It's so important having a story element that we can kind of use to expand our awareness and our scope for being able to think through hard things and verify.
I'm Cedric Harrison. I am a Bloomington native, a product of public housing, and I'm the new director for the new county department of City United. Also was invited here from the same parties that the others expressed, and I just agreed to be on this panel around this topic, as I feel like my lived experience could be valuable thoughts and things for this conversation. I'm actually not a lover of books, but I swear my degree is legit in college. I just came up in the era and generation where it was usually an audio visual of a book close by. So I'm a mass comm broadcasting major, so I watched a lot of videos around the topic of this book, and I think I could easily draw to some conclusions just from my own lived experience around some of these direct topics. So looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I have a few comments online that it's a little hard to hear, so I'm going to plug in the microphone and just allow you all to pass that. It is long enough to pass back and forth, and that'll give it a little bit of extra information. Thank you for that. I apologize.
Sure. So one thing that we're highlighting this evening is that piece on intergenerational trauma. In reading the book, thinking about the context of the book, thinking about our own lived experience and expertise and how we spend our time thinking and serving, were there any points in the book that really underscored that kind of transference of trauma, passing it down over generations? For me, there was one point in the story where the author's mother, the author of the book's mother, did a meeting, and even he noticed that it was unjust or passing on this, and she essentially said it was going to that was one example of that generational trauma that's still for me so real, and stories I'm sure that we all know about from our own experiences.
Well, you might be better. You actually read the book.
Yeah, I didn't find the movie. I did read the book. I thought it was an excellent read. So I thought, Jvanete, I think that's an excellent illustration. Multiple times throughout the book, they talk about or give examples of like transgenerational transmission of trauma and thought processes and individual experiences that just kind of go from, grandparents to parents to children. And that the fear is a word to copy, right? So that kind of is woven through this book. Fear of police, fear of being seen, fear of how you're going to be treated, fear of how people are going to react to you. And it's like so vividly described in this book. It's just, became very real to me. And it's not necessarily my own personal experience coming up, but learned a lot actually reading the book and connecting with the characters and kind of doing some side reading and getting up to speed on some of these things. And then as I think back, certainly transgenerational trauma is very real. And so I'm finding, there's lots of, even though epigenetics is kind of a new, area of research, it hasn't been around very long, lots of ongoing research that's showing, there are, changes in people's DNA expression based on trauma, based on the environment, and based on what they're exposed to. Lots of examples of it. A lot of it's still being worked out, but absolutely very real. So just that one example of how fear is passed on from generation to generation, just in this family, or as a whole group of people, or as a whole cultural identity, is just so powerful. And to start this conversation, about this is certainly well worth it. Certainly perfect timing. I think that there's lots of illustrations of the transgenerational transmission. So that's just one of them. Thank you.
With that example, I think there's many layers to it. So the passing of that trauma from one to another, sometimes to them is looking like they're doing that generation a favor. Like I need to give you this punishment now so that you won't be punished by somebody else to a higher degree later. And so it's hard to really have that discussion at Thanksgiving dinner table, as you might want to try to express that to another family member, and their reply back is, their lived experience of things that they went through, and that's kind of why they're leading up to that. And so I know whenever if I used when I used to get a beating as a child, I remember my mother saying I'm doing this because I love you. You know what I mean? And so it's a really hard conversation to have with a lot of emotions attached to it, especially when we're not therapists or and so to try to have that at a family dinner table is really tough. But I think Bob was right spot on when he just says fear. They're doing it because they're scared that if they don't do it, that it may come from somewhere else. They just want to make sure that the lesson within that space is learned. And if you ask some people will tell you that those traumatizing experiences actually saved them, because they did have that fear for making a decision that probably could have led to a senseless shooting or some other level, higher degree of discipline or punishment, and so I think it's a conversation that needs to be had around the levels, of engagement around discipline, when it's time to go to an extreme and when it's not, and when an individual may need that type of discipline or something, because it does get literally abused, right? Or that person gets abused, and then it turns from addressing the issue to creating the whole entire victim. Thank you for that share.
And just to go back to what the writer and the story had experienced and now is experiencing with his mother, it's not just the fear for him, it's the fear of what had happened to the father, compounding that fear of what would happen to him. And I think what's unique in the way that the story is told is just that revelation. Even if you don't understand Black history or Black culture, you read the meaning there in that moment. Of not only is she thinking about what could have possibly happened to her son had nothing even happened to the father, right? There was always that underlying fear for her. But what made it real and what made it so urgent was the fact that she had witnessed and had experienced all the things that she was afraid of, right? Happen in their own yard, in their own safe space. And so if there was anything that she could do to be loving to protect him from hurt, this is what she was going to do. And so in that moment, you see that she's terrified, she's trembling, she is traumatized in trying to save her child. And there's so many layers there. that I think Black families, especially as we live and move about, that we have to consider all those layers of trauma that are still there. It's a really delicate place. And with that, are there any other, and Cedric, I think, would be just the person to kind of talk about this with the work that you get to do. There's a therapist who talks a lot about epigenetics and what he calls somatic abolitionism. His name is American. And what he describes when it comes to the trauma response and how it's displayed, he calls it decontextualized trauma response can be considered culture or thought of as culture. So when you were talking about that, what are your thoughts on his statement that culture can be confused with that decontextualized trauma response?
Yes.
I think that I would debate or maybe come back with a question around being more specific around what exactly does culture mean, because culture can mean many different things depending on who's using it and how they're trying to define whatever it is that they're speaking on. I guess there's not an argument to say that there has to be a culture out there somewhere around these entities, but to say that I've only seen a certain group of individuals culturally beat their child would be a lie for me. And so, but I guess that is a cultural space there for like the individuals that I guess accept it or deem it or understand it as necessary. I just think that with the culture, there's not a space that differentiates when it goes too far, like a pop on the hand compared to like, old school discipline. We had to go outside and get the switch from off the bushes, and you wake up the next day with whelps on your leg type of thing. I don't think that there's I think that discipline is all in one realm and not like divided in levels, if that makes a sense. But with culture, I believe that maybe where he was going with that statement around the culture of acceptance with it is that there's like discipline is discipline in that realm. There's no like capacity stopping point level. So that's my thoughts.
And not even just in the sense of discipline. I think there are so many cultures that specific to the book we're talking about, being Black in the South for him as a child. But there are, like you said, many cultures that we can talk about where specific to what those people have gone through, there might be some decontextualized trauma response, would you say? Even if it's not about a group of people in regard to race, maybe a pocket of people that have served or been refugees or experienced really hard things over generations too.
I think there's lots of examples of trauma, whole culture's trauma. And so there's some research on Holocaust victims, or they talk about the lost generation in Australia. They talk about, there's lots of examples of horrible things happening to, large numbers of people, right? And how that kind of continues and to exist and kind of helps, or not helps, but becomes part of the cultural identity or part of kind of their experience, and they kind of keep that alive transgenerationally, right? Certainly, when we're talking with this book specifically, Black Americans in the South specifically, they're talking about, racism is part of this, oppression is part of this, being afraid of the police and police brutality and just another kid, right? and to bring that shit back to the mom who was beating Soot to try to protect him, right? She would talk about having the conversation, and I kept thinking about that because it kept coming back in the book, like, well, she hasn't had the conversation. When she could have the conversation, talk about how we or how they, have to live their life with oppression, racism, police brutality, all these things that kind of not define the culture because there's so much more, but certainly that's part of it. That kind of like being held down and socioeconomic limitations and educational roadblocks, and I mean, it's real things, that you can easily articulate and talk about whether you want to around a Thanksgiving table or in a forum like this, but very real stuff that's like cultural experiences, right? So that's a bit different than I had, right? But I didn't grow up, as a Black youth in the South, but can absolutely identify with this. And as I think about all the people I've worked with, I'm old. I've been doing mental health care for a long time, right? And so people bring their trauma with them, and they it's passed from grandparent to parent to child, and they carry it with them in the military, specifically when you're moving all over the world in all different locations. I mean, you can see people's culture they carry with them, and good and bad. And so some of the cultural identities, are oppressive and negative and causing trauma and causing psychological and behavioral and physiologic problems with their offspring. But some of it's also in your field, like resiliency. I mean, you can also have transgenerational resiliency and things that are adaptive, like the beating, right? So that mom was trying to protect that son, and that seems like a very odd way to go about that, right? From outside looking in, but to try to have him be aware, hey, there are consequences for behavior, and they don't have to be just, and this doesn't have to be fair, and it doesn't have to be equivalent to whatever infraction or whatever kind of fantasized problem, right? So it's just very real stuff. So I thought that was worth talking about. Certainly, I see it in, as it is expressed in, offspring and future generations and such. So I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. So
No, and I mean,
pass them.
the things that we've kind of been talking about the current year is that family history piece. And there was one point in the book where it's when the writer is back home and things are unfamiliar, and he's kind of approached by this man, and he has no clue who this person is. And he finds out it was the police officer who shot the kid or the child from his hometown. And the way the officer talks to him, it comes from that family history place. What have they, what did he experience? And he talks about how his brother is worthless, and he should be a good person because he's sending his niece through school, and all of these layers where you can tell that he is kind of moving through where his place is and someone else is suffering, right? He's trying to use what he knows, his relationship with his family, to kind of take apart, to remove himself from the action of killing his child. So in that space, there's so much that he's really telling, because for me it goes back to that family history, but he does sum it up with doesn't the past matter? Doesn't it count that I've done these things? I'm not summed up with this one horrible incident, but that's what we're talking about with racism and traumas of oppression is being identified. That child was identified, whatever that one thing was. So I don't know if you all want to kind of speak to that particular point in the book, or if there are other broader things within that example that you think are important. Or was that too loaded?
Yeah, I think we pull it back.
Pull it back?
Or not necessarily pull it back, but just land the plane.
Sure. Maybe let's land with how his perception of what he had come from, his family history may have influenced why he thought it was appropriate to approach the writer and kind of ask him to do him a favor and make him look better, despite what he had done.
Yeah, well, I got to first say I'm definitely a big supporter of second chances. I believe that people shouldn't be only held to one decision that they've made in their life. But when it comes to law and justice and the judicial system, I think the big thing there isn't like if people need to question if you're a good person or not. It's really more so the system around you need to be punished or disciplined for that action. And because culturally, as we talk about culture, right, in that culture, if more officers was actually being held accountable for when they made decisions like that, then maybe they would be in more fear of making those decisions the same way that culturally for that Black youth, they have to, out of culture and out of fear, make certain decisions so that they hope that they don't end up in a situation like that. Mm-hmm. So it's like there's an unfair space there when you look at how the judicial system treats individuals that aren't sworn in to protect and serve whenever they make a decision in that way, compared to when somebody in uniform does. Just for example, in North Carolina, period, you can't plead self-defense. You can't come in and say self-defense. They have to say that it is. I had a friend that literally, had to sit in jail for a year and a half until they came to court and made a decision that it was self-defense, involuntary manslaughter. And so that still showed up on his record as a guilty murder charge. And he has been working extremely hard for 10 plus years to work on just changing the space that he can occupy. But for a police officer, that's not the case. So we don't care about what you sent your niece to school or whatever. All we know is that at that moment you did make that decision. And if that was another individual that did not have a badge, did not go through training, or they would be held to a more worse level of discipline, even though there's so many things that we know as up to that for that individual. And when that may not be the same for you culturally, there's even lesser or punishment, or even if it's a punishment at all. I think that's a big thing to look into. But then I think something that was powerful that Bob said came about around like my generation is big on like not passing down generational trauma, and it's like a trend now to like, I'm the generation that's gonna stop my certain family traditions and things of that nature. And so I think that that's how you get into a culture and change a culture from within. Like I know a lot of parents now that are like mentors to me, or like, and they're like my same age, like their kids are older, so I kind of looking at my 3-year-old son and like trying to like figure out now, like, okay, like instead of popping my son when he's misbehaving, what are some of the other things that you all have used and done in practice? Like how many conversations like that aren't had, and I don't know if it's because people are just scared to like admit sometimes they don't know what to do with it, their child or whatever. But for me, that's been huge. For me personally, in my lived experience, it's to talk out loud about what some of those alternatives can be. But to get back to the beginning of what you said about the police officer, I do think that just culturally, if there was more punishment and there was more fear and what would happen if they pulled the trigger on a unarmed citizen or what have you, I believe that there would be trauma there that would make them not pull the trigger. That is the same type of, I guess, trauma response that's used for individuals that are getting beaten in their home because their parents are scared that they go out and misbehave and they can get shot and killed. Sorry about that.
Actually, I'd like to build a little bit about what you said, Cedric, about like kind of breaking the chain of transmission of trauma, changing behaviors, making conscious decisions to do that. I think that's very cool, right? As a psychiatrist, I mean, I look at treatment, diagnosis and treatment. That's kind of my thing. And we talk about trauma and how it gets passed down from generation to generation. You look pretty simple wire diagram often, right? You have an individual or culture that's being traumatized. They don't get treatment. They don't get any. They just and so because they're dealing with it, how they've learned to deal with it, they're not having treatment for PTSD or acute stress reactions or developing depression or substance abuse or things like that. Just kind of continues, right? And so you look at like identifying individuals that have been exposed to trauma, and you identify them, you diagnose them, you offer them treatment, you help them deal with trauma experiences, and they're less likely to transmit that to their kid. And their kids will be less likely to be raised in a home that has, a mom or dad who's really unstable or fearful or, stressed out all the time, right? So the whole system is very stressed. So having, treatment, identifying that this is a very real thing, right? This is just not something on the news. This is every day in Wilmington and everywhere else in America, right? All over, right? And addressing it and saying, let's identify it. Let's try to treat individuals that are traumatized. So individuals that die, mother, father to son, or in a family dealing with that through the education system, and how people can deal with trauma, how they can make better choices. So they're not just going to pass this on or just accept it. It's a very big thing, and I think that there's really no better time than right now. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of people, a lot of thought into this, saying that we're going to make some changes with things. And here in Wilmington, it's been a great experience over 2 years to see lots of being involved like I am with the community, being kind of invited to engagements and such, and having 3, college-age kids that are, they think about these things, they know this matters, they're thinking that this generation is making a big difference on things, and things aren't just going to continue, right? And it does matter. It's huge, super powerful. Right? So good luck trying to break the chain and try to make different choices, but that's not an easy thing to do. What's easy is to fall back on what you know and what you've seen, and just like, well, that's how they did it. So to stop and say, it's not how I'm going to do it. I don't want my kid to follow these footsteps. There's other, as an example, other way to discipline, right? You don't just have to lay hands on your kids. You can talk to them. You can use some kind of behavioral modification. You can restrict access to cool stuff. Take away the stuff they want, or add chores as examples, right? There's lots of other ways to do this. So, so you can affect what's transmitted transgenerationally by making choices like you're talking about. So that's huge. It's great.
I think, the beginning of that is really acknowledgement. A lot of times people don't know that they're acting out of this stuff. And sure, the virus mother in the story didn't have it. That's what's happening. Even there's the story right after this always go where his uncle is, angry and trying to process his feelings, and it's processing the way he would, but it's still some of the mystery to the virus of child, like how he's processing what needs to be done next, or read stuff from his father. So to me, that really does well, that resilience piece, it's acknowledging the hurt, acknowledging how much the trauma that we've gotten to this point. And we are also inherently resilient. You know, the other side of going through an experience or a lifetime of trauma or generations of trauma is still here. There's an element of resilience. There's an element of being able to get to a point where you can acknowledge and confront and learn new ways of knowing, learn new ways of understanding space together and individual use and space on their own. I feel like that is kind of the progression that the writer takes as a coping mechanism, so to speak, of this hallucinations or seeing his mother come back to time to time, or even at the point of he's having that conversation with the police officer who looks into the view and sees it. I interpret it as ancestors, you know, slaves and ancestors from Africa seeing this. And in that moment, to me, it's almost like he is sitting in the resilience of his people. So I think that is ultimately where I think I'm about what our trauma looks like without that can change that is so important.
Yeah, I think there's just this, I think it's a special moment when you're able even to have the time to be able to talk about trauma. People that are usually in trauma, especially for a lot of the communities that I represent and spaces that I occupy, some of the people don't even have time to even realize that they're responding to trauma. You know, every day is a new trauma experience. And one of the biggest things for me was being able to have a moment in life where I was able just to slow down and have that conversation around therapy. And even like I went to therapy in different spurts for different things at different times. And like just recently, I had found out that like working hard was a trauma response. Anybody that knows me, you know, I'm director for the county. I have 2 businesses. I'm on a few boards. So I realized like that was a trauma response, and just like me with my own businesses and things of that nature, just having the experiences of looking, trying to find another to do something or help with something and not finding it. And my trauma response was, I'll forget it, I'll just go do it myself. And I just came to a realization that like I was in a space of privilege to be able to come to that moment. And it takes me that to think about others around, like what, like if I'm in this privileged space and it took me this long to get to a moment like this, you know, how deep and how long will it take for an individual that I know is not at a moment of, or have a level of privilege like I do, to where they're able to even have enough time to take a break to even have somebody or know somebody that they can connect with to even figure out if they're having a trauma response, you know? And then another thought I had about around what you said in the book about him going certain places in life, having certain thoughts of seeing his mother and certain ancestors. I don't think that was necessarily like a hallucination. I think for us, and I think everybody in the room can maybe agree to this experience as well, is that like when you're younger and your elders say certain things to you that don't hit until you're older, that's kind of how it sounded and felt for me. Like there's certain situations now that I'm going through as an adult, and my mom does pop up in my head, you know, she's like in the back of the room, and it's like, I can hear that thing that she told me years ago that went totally over my head, and now it's like resonating so perfectly in the moment. And so I don't know, maybe that was maybe one of his thoughts. That might be a question I would have. I've been trying to think about what I would ask somebody to get to that might be one of his questions.
Yeah. That is a question that was raised to the office. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned those points that really come to mind sometimes until you're in that situation. And I think that's kind of shown throughout the book because the types of people who see these from this past are it's very situational. Like when we see his mother, specific.
And all those things play a part. And all those things ultimately play a part in the decisions that you make. Right? Like those things were distilled in you even at that age, even when it went over your head, it was installed in you at that moment. You probably just didn't activate it, until you were able to. And that kind of goes back to, the situation in the book with the police officer shooting the individual. It was a lived experience that he had all the way up until that moment, and he's thinking about all of the things that he did right leading up until that moment, right? And that goes back to the needs and all of that. But then he probably never had time or moments to think and look back at some of the things that culturally or comfortably over time when he was younger was okay and didn't look like an issue. But now it is an issue, and he probably never had a moment to even come to that space. And I'm sure there's a lot of inner reconstruction that goes on after that moment is made. Like, because now you're trying to think, am I a good person? I can do these good things. I still made this decision. I would hope, I don't know, I can't say. A part of me feels like sometimes these things are very intentional and they know exactly what they're doing. It's not I'm sorry, I do think some officers do make those decisions and are happy about it. And I'm unfortunate to say that, but I do believe that's the truth. But for some, I do believe that it's just sometimes out of fear and sometimes just post moments and literally culturally things that have been installed in you over time lead up to that one decision. And I just really think that is.
But to that fact of growing up in the same area as the writer of the book, some of the same people, the same community, but then also identifying that the writer had been able to get away and be successful, and how for some reason that was a little bit different because he was Black and he was white and then only gone down to Florida, as he says in the book. That was the farthest he had gone. So it's almost like he is underscoring all of that, which you said, those things that have been instilled over time. That in the moment when he pulled the trigger, crystallized, and I would say his body. That was like an embodied experience for him. He said, story says, I did not kill that boy, my finger, but pulled the trigger. And for me, that was very much all of these things instilled in that conversation where it went. The trigger showed up in his body. There's something different about this kid, about that is threatening.
Thank you. A couple things. One, to go back a bit to the image of the mom walking back out in the cornfields, I had a thought after, right? And a couple different interpretations of that. So when I was reading that, I thought that was a way for me. My response to that was it was kind of broadening the conversation away from just Soot and his mom and and one individual shot in their front yard, and it's like a small personal family story. And in today's time, going back to how we describe all these individuals back through almost like through the period, through the looking glass, kind of looking back even to slavery, people in chains, things like that, saying this has been going on for a very long time. This is not just an unfortunate event, one-time thing that this one police officer shot this one person. It's like it makes a much broader conversation. That's how I took that. So I thought that was pretty powerful for me. That just made a big statement. It just made me, have so much more respect for this author. It's just such an easy read. You're just reading, wow, this is just like, it's loosely woven together, and it has like all these not, is it hallucinations? Is it some kind of depersonalization? And what is this? I'm a psychiatrist. I'm trying to put labels on things and trying to look at the criteria and make it fit nicely into some kind of DSM criteria box so I can code it and all that. And certainly none of that fits so conveniently. But the descriptions are so powerful and so well written. It's just you just get drawn into it. But talking about, so that's that piece for me, how I read that, still do. But having the piece with the cop walking up and talking to the author about that piece and really trying to dissociate himself from from the lane, right? I didn't do what my finger did. I did all these other things, the pros and cons. I'm still a good person, but yeah, but you can't shoot kids, right? So that's the bottom line, right? It doesn't matter who you love, what color you are, who you're great to, right? You can't shoot kids, right? So that's a big deal. And whether that's part of that individual's culture, small town, and hadn't gone around much and been exposed to other people and other ways of thinking, probably just like you said, it's like a culmination of how you were raised, what you've heard, how your families responded, how other people have responded, and just that was just kind of the final act, which was tragedy, horrible, rather than crime. So those are the things I was thinking about.
So it's funny because you said you can't shoot a little kid, but I would believe that because of his experience up until that point, that he didn't look at that individual as a little kid. Right. He looked at them as a target, as a criminal. He looked at this as this is something that I need to do. In reality, we can all relate to or compare that to the Trayvon Martin situation. There's this Zimmerman guy, a police officer, and this kid is walking through the neighborhood with a lady on Skittles and tea, which is what kids will probably have in their hands, especially Arizona tea. And when we hear that, we think kid or what have you, but in that moment, he's thought danger and fear. And you have to question where that comes from. You have to look into that person's past.
Something that goes right down to everything that the officer had lived up to that point, not to threat and to fear. But to me, that also is an example of how racism is a trauma for everybody. Nobody mistakes the hold that has on our country. We, as Black people, suffer in our bodies and our existence and our experience, but white people too suffer from that, not the actual fear of loss of life, but the threat of the fear of loss of life. Does that make sense? To me, in that exchange with the officer, it's almost like there was something that he was supposed to be living into just by virtue of him being white, that he was not able to do because of that factor. And you can see that Black kid embodied all of the threat, all of the lost opportunities, all of the fear that he was living. The experiences are not the same, but it is traumatic. It takes away from all of us.
while we have a second, I have a question from online, and so they asked, mental health care is very difficult for large portions of the population to access. What are some ways intergenerational trauma can be addressed when there is such a lack of resources?
So don't work for the public health service, but I think that acknowledging it, having the conversation, saying, hey, let's start talking about this and start educating, right? Having programs like this, getting into schools, right? Funding Port City United to get in and start working with like disenfranchised families and systems and trying to start making changes at that level. Mental health care, I would say we don't have a national health service, right? We don't have public health care, even in the United States, which is surprising to me, right? That people can't just walk in and get health care. So I'm against that. I'm for tax free more to provide services for everybody. So I'm in that camp. But there's limited access to mental health care. I think that's changing in a way because you see lots of advertisements about counseling and online things. And so the stigma is decreasing and people are being proud or being brave enough to say, you know, I needed some help at one point in time, so I reached out to get it, right? So you lead by example saying, hey, you know, if I need a little bit of help, I'm going to get help, right? And so having those conversations is a big thing. In the military, trying to like beat down stigma and trying to eliminate barriers to care were big, you know, programs, and I infused lots of my career and energy into that to get to people. There's also stigmas. Some people don't trust mental health care. They don't trust the system, or they're, you know, oppressed, or they're mistreated, or they're assumed to be, you know, making bad decisions versus having some kind of health condition, and that's been their life experience. So why would they think that the mental health profession is going to treat them differently or listen to them differently, right? Or assume that they're going to understand the plight of a Black American in the South right now, right? So a lot of folks stay away from mental health care for that reason, right? They don't trust mental health. They don't know what to expect, and the stigma is a big thing. Access, huge problem. I think that hopefully we're moving towards solving that problem. We need lots more, you know, therapists, and psychiatrists, and psychologists, and social workers, and licensed practicing counselors. So it's a real issue. There's not enough. But I think that reaching out, trying to get into, you know, whatever resources are available in your community, whether it's through the school, whether it's through other nonprofit organizations or county health services. I think trying to get into resources, trying to get help is the, you know, acknowledging it and then trying to seek resources. That's the big thing. That's kind of like the next reasonable step to try to get engaged, and hopefully with persistence you'll be able to find, or they'll be able to find, we will be able to find help with these problems.
And I think, you know, you mentioned the stigma, that is, you know, it is such a huge thing, but when we go through hard things, when we need help, it's not because of mental weakness, it's our biology. You know, we're designed to have a stress response, and that stress response, if you have it for long enough, it deteriorates our body systems. You know, it can do all sorts of things that disconnect us from relationship and, you know, being able to access some care. So, you know, just knowing that it's not because something is wrong with you. Getting mental health supports is really about taking care of yourself. And then being able to find somebody who can understand the kind of trauma that you are going through when it comes to racism, which is a real trauma. Being able to find mental health caregivers and therapists who are Black, who come from the people that you come from is so important too.
Can we say the question again?
The question was, what are some ways intergenerational trauma can be addressed when there's such a lack of resources for mental health care to large portions of the population?
Yeah, so Bob was right. In Hanover County, you can call Port City United at 910-798-4444. we would be more than happy to connect you to that service. That's one of the current ways that Hanover County is working to combat those issues. So yes, I agree with Bob on that. The county does have different entities. They have mental health workers in elementary and middle schools as well. So I think that's huge. I think it's only not time before we're able to have those individuals in high schools as well. I just think here in Wilmington, that because of racism, there is a lack of people that are in higher career positions that are in a place to be able to have a voice at the table so that things can be implemented around their thoughts and expertise. I believe a lot of people that are concerned about these issues in Wilmington don't have the lived experiences also to follow up with that. And that's a major gap at the table when it comes to making plans towards these issues. So I would say that, but then I also would say that I believe that currently right now there is a moment in time where the stigma is slightly softening around mental health services. I think people do think now, I think at one point in time, people felt like if you were meeting with a therapist that you instantly was bipolar or whatever, or like a conversation with a therapist was one conversation away from being in a hug jacket, but I feel like now people are being a little bit more open to having that conversation with therapists, even just from my own experience. I still don't even know if I do it right per se, but I do feel better when I leave, like from talking with them. And I'm like, I don't know if I fixed anything, like I don't know if I just, complain to that person for an hour and they're like, thank you for sharing, So yeah, I think there needs to be a little bit more discussion around the proper ways of going through the process of trauma. I think there was a big push to just get people in the therapist seats, but now I think there needs to be a bigger push around how the art around that conversation and how it can be done properly to get you to another place. Because I know I'm not scared to have that conversation with therapists and walk through that door, but I have had experiences where, like, still to this day, I haven't found like that's my therapist. You know what I mean? Like I've had sessions with multiple individuals, and I know if I wasn't in this privileged space, it could possibly turn me away from continuing to push forward in that direction.
I also just want to take a minute to plug the library services. We actually employ a full-time social worker who is happy to talk to anybody and connect anybody in the community with resources. It's a newer push in public libraries to have that service, and we've had one here full-time for over a year. So we are kind of at the forefront of trying to address the mental health needs of the community, and she is an absolute, the work she does is just amazing. And so, but that's one thing that I will say is that you'll see more and more service points where we can reach people in the community who need the services. We are starting to install people there who can be of service that way.
And I think also, we are also as a task force trying to build a trauma-informed community, because there are some folks who might not necessarily need to see a mental health therapist on a regular basis, but still need that support. And so, just the idea that you can go to the library and get support is incredible. So, building that trauma-informed community where that they are treated well and not re-traumatized when they try to access services, and there are people who can speak common language around resilience and understand what trauma is, various spaces that they can go into around resilience, not just funnel straight to
Two things. One, I wanted to shamelessly plug somebody else in that has been actually doing a good job of trying to be more transparent with the art around the conversation of therapy, especially when it deals with trauma. And that's French Shopper Cease, where Julia Amish, we're doing a series called Flipping the Barbershop, where they've been able to have transparent, open therapy session discussions and after that, kind of analyze the discussion right there in front of the people to expand. So that has been one of the most pressing things that I've seen around that push. And then also, I know something that we're about to really start trying to do is actually bring the therapists to the people. Like, as much as I love the library and I'm here today, in today's world, some people are, if they weren't already accustomed to going to the library, there's so many different virtual ways to do so that, and so for a lot of people, it's almost like if the therapist isn't on an app, that is, it's almost hard to get in contact with them. And so we're trying to, during some of our moments in our community, we'll have what's called resilience responses, and we're actually currently looking to hire licensed therapists right now to be in-house with Jvanete. So anybody looking for a job, is a licensed therapist, Colorado's. But I think that's one of the solutions as well, is to try to bring the therapy a little bit closer to the people that can need it the most, because they know more than you all know better than anybody, that those individuals probably don't even have the time, or it's no telling how long the time will take for them to actually try to take the initiative to go and find someone.
Do you all have any questions here in the room?
I'd like to comment on one thing, and that is the step to acknowledging generational trauma is really complicated, and it takes us 2 seconds to say you have to acknowledge it, but it takes a lifetime to be able to acknowledge it. Right? And it takes having conversations with your parents, having conversations with your aunts and uncles, having conversations with your grandparents, to the extent that they are willing to dig deep into their own life experience so that you understand a little bit more about how you're raised and how you're raising your own children if you have them, and the communities in which they were struggling to try to make a living. I mean, it's just really important to have an opportunity whenever possible to learn from your elders what they have endured, what they have survived, what struggles they had to get through as they were raising you. Because when we're kids, we see our parents in a very different light than what we're able to see them when we're adults, right? So that step to acknowledge it is in itself, I think, a really complicated process.
Another slide. So being in Wilmington, we're actually very, very lucky because there are a lot of resources here for mental health and outreach and developmental intervention and these types of things. And I was fortunate to be on the Anti-Violence Coalition, and we met multiple times over the last year, and lots of programs kind of sprung from this. And they were able to also, for all the nonprofits and all these other very helpful organizations, to kind of centralize some of this and have referral sources and referral bases. Like we talked about, flipping the barber shop, and there's lots of other opportunities in Wilmington that have people that care and are willing to help and are available and getting out into the communities. It's not just sitting back in the hospital and waiting for patients to come. Not that, right? On the ground, in the communities, in the schools, and with the police force, there's individuals that do it, and programs that follow kids through elementary and middle school, trying to get into the high school. I can't remember all the names of all these programs, but I was just very impressed with this small town where there was a list of all these organizations that were like trying to make a difference and trying to help, provide services. So we're in a good place and a good time to try to get help. And not that everybody needs to be in therapy, but to have resources if you need them, or bring people that need resources to get those, people in contact with the resource, whether it's families or individuals or whatever. So Wilmington has a lot of that. I can't list all of them, but you have a number to contact, right? And we have someone at the library, and there's lots of other places, your office as well, right? So to make these connections and referrals and all that.
All right. So Well, on that note, we are going to come to a close this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. I cannot express how grateful I am that we've been able to sit down and have this conversation. One of the things that came about when in the book is how important it is to have a conversation after a crisis. Just on an everyday, it's important to engage in these conversations and make sure that the community is talking about the things that it needs to talk about to improve on and to get better. And the only way, problems do not get better when they're ignored. The only way is to actually talk about them and address them and move forward. So again, thank you so much for joining us. For those who are participating, those online, there will be a short survey emailed to you in a couple of hours. Please take the time. It's, I think, 4 questions. Those in the room, there's a couple of surveys at the back. If you can fill that out as well, that just helps me know how we're doing here with programming. And again, the final discussion in this series will be next Tuesday, 5:30 to 7, same time, same place. I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.